So we have now our second session, second work session. We have 4 communications. I have to begin with this session, and then we will have Begonia Pessis was there, Premes Lalu, and Heidi Grunebaum. It's about 1 hour with a rhythm of 10-20, 10-20 for the communications. And, well, that's it. I have to begin now. So in the first place, I have to apologize for my English is pathetic, and I wrote my text and I couldn't have it revised by a charitable heart. So I hope that it's at least minimally intelligible in order that you can translate it into English. So I will begin with the reading. Untranslatability is mainly addressed as a question of principle with reference to poetry. At a distance, not so far away, stands philosophy, as is testified, for instance, by Barbara Gasson's Dictionary of Untranslatables, which brings to the forefront the intrinsic difficulty of pretending, for instance, that what is called truth in English, not to speak of verdad or pravda, would say and mean the same as Greek aletheia. And it may be recalled that Heidegger puts on this word the stamp of a highest criterion, renouncing to translate it by Wahrheit in favor of Unverborgenheit. The rebuttal of the pretension of equivalence may be supported by diverse arguments. Take, for instance, the argument that underlines that the meaning of a term or an expression depends on and varies according to the contexts in which it is employed, whether idiomatic or rhetorical, historical, cultural, or directly pragmatic. And certainly we cannot legitimately presuppose a sufficient similarity between contexts, not to speak of their identity. However, no stark thesis of untranslatability can be drawn from a stance like this. Such a thesis is rather associated with the argument that asserts a kind of pristine coinage. Even though it might take into account contextual elements, this thesis nevertheless radicalizes them, charging the term, certain terms, under the guise of fundamental words of philosophy, with a density that cannot be specifically resolved. In this orientation, untranslatable is not properly the term, but the relation of the word with its language, and to its language and to the worldview and experience that is articulated and expressed in the latter. This is an argument that we can find in various theoretical milieus. Just think of the aforementioned Heidegger, who makes of translation a veritable and decisive event which compromises the comprehension that Dasein has of itself, and for this reason does not consist in a mere process of substitutions and exchanges, but involves the opening of a world, the establishment of a historical existence, and ultimately the poetic essence of language. A first rapid glance at such considerations makes clear that any ideal of transparency in translation is a whim. A second one accentuates the premises and consequences which may evince that in translation there is much more at stake than a simple communicative process. Along with this, one has to take into account that a discourse of philosophy, as every discourse, as language itself in the end, is a web of transmissions and transfers, of borrowings, filtrations, and contaminations. Briefly, that every language is multilingual and is made of translation, of an incessant process of translations from without and from within. This dilemma, for theoretically it is one, prevails in translation to the same extent that translation makes it apparent. Everything is translatable, everything is untranslatable. Or maybe better, and better for a reason that I expect may surface later, everything is translating, nothing is translatable. Translating is an open-ended task, haunted at every step by its being doomed to fail. And it is probable, as Franz Rosenzweig, Andres was quoting him, as Franz Rosenzweig contended, that it is one of the kind, that is of the kind of problems that are resolvable only in practice, not in theory. Everybody has to translate, and everybody does, but because he ultimately speaking is nothing else than translating. So we may grant that, at least theoretically, translation is impossible. But there's no untranslatable as such. There's no coining of meaning that would be pure, virginal, emphatically original, which would impose derivation and degradation to all its similes and surrogates, or condemn them to the miserable condition of a hopeless and equivocal echo of a primary source. Otherwise said, there is no untranslatable before translating. This may seem a truism, but it is so only from an empirical point of view. It is obvious that you may attempt to translate in order to get entangled in the impasses that a diligent translator cannot but acknowledge. Yet it is not so that he or she, as if trapped in an irrevocable aporia, would come across an untranslatable that was already there as a fund or an untouchable capital of the original. It is translating that produces it. Translation, by repeating the original, produces the untranslatable, and with it, the sense of the originality of meaning, which is the very concept of the original. Therefore, and this is the paradox of repetition, there is originality, there is meaning, effect, and truth of the original, only starting from its second inscription. Otherwise said, translation inscribes the untranslatable in the original and constitutes it primarily. Which is then the place of the untranslatable? It could be said that it is a place of transferal, that is, a place of the crisis of transferal. It is as if the task of translating, when confronted with its most pressing predicaments, would question the original precisely in those spots where it cannot answer. Those are the spots in which a trembling prevails, the trembling of the tension of a thinking that strives to articulate itself in words, but which is not a thought already performed, perfectly rounded and self-contained, but one that can only find itself through this striving and quest. If the untranslatable is already a property of the original, it is so as a blind moment, inaccessible to the signifying power of the original, or else everything would be translatable in it. Indeed, the notion of the untranslatable implies a paradox or an aporia. In one sense, the untranslatable defines the very condition of the original. Something is not an original by the sole fact of being the primary source. This is nothing else than a datum, while the concept of the original has a certain transcendental air. I say that the untranslatable defines the very condition of the original insofar as it determines the difference between the latter, between the original, and all of its possible translations. Yet in its turn, if the original contains the untranslatable, it is untranslatable for itself. The untranslatable is a trace of that which singularizes the text, that which makes in it the difference between the conatus of thinking, the present state of language, and the conventional representations current in its context. The untranslatable is at the same time the condition of possibility of translation and of the original. An original would be an original, I mean an original in the transcendental meaning of the word, which denotes this transcendental meaning, this asymptotic point where words and meanings are one and the same, if there were no difference between what a text says and what a text makes. But there is always this difference, or at least I may state more cautiously that a text says always something that is not necessarily the same that it makes. In any case, this difference is a space of translation as well as a place of what I call the crisis of transferal. This difference is the untranslatable, which, as this difference, is the condition of possibility of translation and of the original. There is an early text of Jorge Luis Borges that contains the first formulation of his concept of translation, which other subsequent productions of the Argentinian writer would emphasize or vary. One of them even would repeat it literally. The title of this text is The Homeric Versions, and it is included in discussion. I think it is from 1933. A general premise, a bit watered down in its tone like all Borgesian starting points, suggests, I quote, "No problem is as consubstantial to literature and its modest mystery as the one posed by translation," end of quote. Trying to address the problem, I will pick up 3 points from this brief article. Firstly, the objection, the objection that translations are inexorably inferior to the so-called originals, that in truth, my paraphrase may go beyond what is explicit in the text, that in truth they are rather the reprocessing of a draft text. As Borges bluntly says, I quote, "The concept of the definitive text corresponds only to religion or exhaustion," end of quote. A complement to this, in a second place, is the incertitude. Borges calls it the categorical difficulty, perhaps a trait that is exclusive of Homer, the incertitude about what pertains to authorship and what merely pertains to language. This difficulty, as is easy to see, increases the more removed the work is in time and the more alien is the culture, the customs, the habits, and the idiomatic expressions that contextualize or nourish it. Such incertitude is like a breeding ground for the variety of versions. Third point, the two modes of translation illustrated by the famous debate between Francis William Newman and Matthew Arnold, two Hellenists of high standard, concerning the balladic translation of the Iliad attempted by the former, by Newman. Of course, it is about the literal and the free mode of translating. Borges compiles 6 alternative versions of the same Homeric passage, as many other evidences of those modes, which are strongly marked by their diversity. They are questioned in view of fidelity. The conclusion, or the conjecture, is that none of them is faithful, and that all of them are faithful. In the end, it could be that Samuel Butler's version of bourgeois sobriety, mainly informative and pragmatic, were the one that is more in line with the blind singer's tenor, irretrievably vanished for us. Such inquiry suggests a different view of the untranslatable, more or less as I was insinuating before. If the untranslatable, which conditions the task of translating, is an effect of translation and not a property of the original, then the untranslatable is not an obstacle, but sheer possibility. It gives rise to what I would call translativity, meaning by this not a series of stable reference and of regulated procedures, not a pre-constituted space delimited by origins and destinations of meaning, but an operation that in the first place opens a space in which it is itself possible. This is a space of transferal. In this sense, the untranslatable is the always open-ended, interminable task of translating. That's it. Well, I have to invite Begonia Pesis. Oh, it's about Schopenhauer.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Pablo stole my apologize. I really need to apologize for my English, which is very, very bad and poor and rudimentary. So I ask you patience and understanding with me. Yeah, I will start now. I'm going to talk about Schopenhauer philosophy and its relation with translation. When considering Schopenhauer's ideas, always an obligation is unconditionally imposed, that of making visible what constitutes his core thought, the hermeneutic key to understand and explain all the phenomena of the world. Certainly, this procedure makes the encounter with a new text on Schopenhauer, like this one, annoying, repetitive, and hackneyed, but it is also a fair procedure because it forces us to keep in mind the intimate engine, origin, and destination of his ideas. Basically, his doctrine can be condensed into two general premises. The first is that the whole world is a mere representation of the subject who perceives it. This representation obeys the principle of sufficient reason, which imposes the universal form of phenomena, specifically being an object for a subject and the determination of causality, space, and time. The second premise is that the universe as a thing in itself is something different from its representation, no matter how objective it comes close to be. The noumenal content of the world is not subordinated to the principle of sufficient reason, which is only valid in the phenomenal world. Since we only experience and gather knowledge through this principle, the thing in itself is unknowable. It cannot even become an object for a subject, which is the most elementary of representative condition. However, Schopenhauer proposed an approach to the deep reality of the world through its most transparent phenomenon, our own will. In the human will, the veil that covers the thing in itself is less dense. It is thinner than anyone else. Schopenhauer concludes that the world is the manifestation and objectification of the will to live, the ontological substratum of the world. The will is a volitional impulse with a present and incessant nature, which impels to existence, to self-preservation, and in some beings to reproduction. In animals, the will is activated and functions through motives, in plants through stimuli, and in inorganic beings through mechanical causes. All existence consists in an endless cycle of agitation, gestation, desire, satisfaction, of an insatiable and universal will. Obviously, I cannot make a detailed, meticulous, and extended exposition. I would rather venture a reflection or a very interesting antagonism in Schopenhauer's philosophy, because I think the confrontation of these two poles makes emerge certain interesting elements and commitments. On one hand, he holds a complete pessimism regarding translation between natural languages, and on the other hand, an optimism regarding the expression or translation of the will, the noumenal world, by the means of representation. This happens in the arts, especially in music, and also in authentic philosophy. Schopenhauer is not a purist in the use of language. He believes in the advantage of importing all the foreign words that are necessary to raise precision, nuance, and enrich the expressive competence. He even considers that the learning of foreign languages, hopefully as distant as possible from the mother tongue, is mandatory in order to broaden the conceptual sphere and ways of thinking. However, he is purist in terms of the original work in relation to its translations. Concerning skepticism about translation between different tongues, Schopenhauer is categorical. For him, both a literal translation and a free translation are to the original as chicory is a substitute to genuine coffee. The necessary insufficiency of full translation is due to the fact that a sentence, expression, or word can almost never be translated from one language to another in such a way that it can have exactly and fully the same effect. Concepts between languages can be similar, related, but there will be always a modification or nuance that distance them. Even words that have an easy translation, his example is bread, in other languages functions as circles that overlap but are not completely concentric. Even in simple prose, the best translation is to the original as a very pale and remote copy. He says that for this reason, every translation is something dead and its style is something forced, rigid, and unnatural. If not, it will be a free translation, that is to say that it will be approximate and directly false. He himself curses anyone who, in future version of his work, dares to change a syllable, a letter, or a punctuation mark. As a parenthesis, we can point out that those who dramatically proclaim the impossibility of translation are usually great translators. Schopenhauer is not an exception. He translated Baltasar Gracián, The Art of Worldly Wisdom, partially El Criticón, and he strove to translate Hume and Lawrence Stern into German and Kant into English, although these latter initiatives did not receive enough editorial enthusiasm. At the same time, it can be noted that Schopenhauer's work is infested with translation in a broad sense. There is a translational frenzy that contrasts with his theoretical mistrust of translation in the restricted sense, even though he practiced it. Following this this thought, I will explore some of the way in which it is possible to translate the nominal world of the will from and through the means of phenomenal world of representation. Translation is conceived under the figure of the mirror, very traditional. By means of some resources, it will be possible to reflect in knowledge the essence of the will to live. Animal sounds inform about the two most primal realities, pain and pleasure, longing and satisfaction, but animals are slave to them, as we are in most of our day-to-day acts. Therefore, those sounds are only expression of the will, not of the knowledge of the will. And human language can only refer to the will reflectively with more objective pretensions in art and philosophy. In everyday life and even in science, language is an instinct operation of the intellect to try to deal with the interests of our will in full illusion of the principle of individuation and the principle of sufficient reason. In poetry or any literary art, on the other hand, words gain an unusual potency. We could say that because of the transformation accomplished by art, the word becomes a mirror and not longer a mirage of the will. In fact, all the fine arts promote the intuitive capture of aesthetic ideas. The latter are the eternal modes of finite and plural things, like Platonic ideas. They are the adequate and immediate objectification of the will. This means that they are objects for a subject of knowledge, of course, but they are not governed by the principle of sufficient reason. Ideas constitute the grades of objectification of the will, from the highest to the lowest. That means from universal forces like gravity or inertia to higher grades like plants or humans. Schematized, or in time, these ideas coincide with our classification of organic and inorganic species. In artistic representation, we don't perceive a singular thing, but rather an idea through it. Therefore, in the knowledge of ideas, the essence of the will to live, which adopt different forms, disguise, clothes, and figures, becomes clearer and more distinct. In the contemplation of each and every idea, it is possible to witness a particular mode of expression of the will to live. In addition to this objective flank of the aesthetic idea, it is the comprehension of the idea, there is a necessary subjective side. To become a subject without volition, a willless, painless, timeless, and pure subject of knowledge. A large part of the aesthetic pleasure or enjoyment, it is possible because the intellect no longer serves the will, although it is only for an ephemeral instant. It emancipates itself from the interest of the will and for a few moments sees things as what they are, not in their relationship with our will. In that sense, things don't generate animosity or adhesion or desire or rejection. This state of objectivity is blissful because it frees us from the torments of our restless will. The silence of the will that appears in the aesthetic experience is, as Rosette says, the joy of no longer feeling affected by one's own affections, or as Safransky says, a recreation that offers us the opportunity to see the world and behave in its presence as if we had abandoned it. For Schopenhauer, life is never beautiful, only its images transfigured in the clear mirror of art. Things are beautiful to behold, not to be. For a moment, our cravings are foreign to us. The word as idea remains, but the word as will has disappeared. I quote, "As the subject loses himself in the object, he forgets even his individuality, his will, and only continues to exist as the pure subject, so that it is as if the objects alone were there and not him." End of quote. But music stands alone, quite cut off from all other fine arts. Music is an immediate expression of the will. It is a direct objectification of the will. The other art reflects the will through ideas. It does not refer to one or another desire, one or another satisfaction, but to the essential desire and satisfaction. Its object of music are the movements of the will, pleasure and pain, the only reality for the will. Music constitutes the secret chronicle of the will, of life itself, with its agitation, yearnings, and sorrows. Musical language is universal, and it is always understood. It is the language of feeling and passion, not the one of abstraction, which is why its effect is so intense and infallible, more powerful and penetrating than of the other arts. For Schopenhauer, I quote, "If it were possible to give a perfectly accurate, complete explanation of music, this would also be a sufficient explanation of the world in concepts, and thus it will be the true philosophy. If music is the universal language in which the intimate essence of the world is expressed, philosophy is nothing more than a repetition and a correct expression of that essence in universal concepts. Schopenhauer believes that the philosopher should rely on the arts, which should be his model, rather than the science. Philosophy does not pretend to explain the world according to the principle of sufficient reason, which is mostly suitable to explore relations between things. It is not interested in why or what the world is for, but rather focused on what it is and how it is. The task of philosophy is to reproduce in abstracto, to translate into concept everything that comes from feeling, intuitive knowledge, and aesthetic experience. In this way, such a philosophy would be a reproduction or reflection in abstract concepts of what a subject experiences when he finds himself confronted with the beauty of nature or the great work of art. Literature, for instance, is a repository of examples to philosophy and relates to it like experience to science. The potential that philosophy loses to provoke direct effects compared to arts and music, it gains in durability or permanence. Philosophy, in fact, prepares the spirit for the authentic redemption of the will, not the transitory and ephemeral of art, but the radical negation of the will in ethics and aesthetics. To contrast these two poles in Schopenhauer's theory causes at least perplexity. To translate a text written in another language seems to be a task more unattainable and condemned to failure than that of translating the dark thing in itself, the will. In my opinion, in spite of his chapter of Parerga and Paralipomena on the impossibility of translation, from his Metaphysics of Beauty, a translability of philosophical works and artworks can be deduced, always under the condition that the translator has artistic genius. It is useful to begin by remembering that the starting point of both disciplines was itself a translation exercise. In the case of the artistic genius is capable of translating the aesthetic idea from everyday life, history, the behavior of men, or nature. Philosophy, on the other hand, translates intuitive knowledge into abstract and universal concepts. The conditions that Schopenhauer imposes on art are the liberation from the torment of the will, the subjective enjoyment, and secondly, the intuition of an aesthetic idea or an aspect of that idea, the objective pleasure. If this is all that art takes, and if art has such a precise purpose, I don't see why it is opposed to the possibility of being translated. The translation simply had to achieve the same effect, the calming of the will and the expression of the same aspect of the idea. So, we find that works of art are born from an intuitive experience by a genius or a person in a genial disposition who reproduced it in the work of art. Basically, if someone has such an experience in the presence of an artwork, he could potentially be able to reproduce it. He just needs to be a genius. Schopenhauer says, I quote, "The relationship of the artist with the original on which his exhibition is based is precisely that he has grasped the idea of humanity or roses or gravity or spiders from some particular aspect that he wishes to exhibit." End of quote. Ergo, if the translator can relate to the original, now the work and not the world, in that same way, then he could perfectly well translate it. Having in mind literature, he only has to reach the aesthetic effect and express the same aspect of the aesthetic idea into another language. Strictly speaking, there is no original, but one more occasion to reflect the will by means of an idea. No expression is original or previous, nor does it have priority over another. But it will be the same work in the sense that they will have the same content and also the same subjective effect, which is no other than the liberation of the regime of the will and pain. I can understand that a literal translation, rigid and lacking in beauty, can be bad for him insofar as it obstructs the aesthetic experience. But when he says that a free translation is false, it is quite incredible in light of his rules, because the truth or falsity of an artwork has to do with its eidetic content about ideas. That is the only criterion. When he says that a free translation is false, he seems to place himself on the empirical plane, under the principle of sufficient reason, not on the metaphysical plane. According to Schopenhauer, elements such as the beauty of words, rhythm, rhyme, and so on contribute enormously to the aesthetic effect, but are not its main or most significant content. Therefore, it follows that they could be replaced by other elements that what matters is the content of the idea. The surface can be changed. It is necessary, however, that the task is performed by someone who has artistic genius and has had an intense aesthetic experience in his contact with the work. The arts show through an example, through a temporary image, what life and the world are. In that sense, they can be perfectly replaced by other close, temporary images, as long as they refer to the same thing and show a great aesthetic quality. Schopenhauer argues that ideas cannot simply be communicated because they speak to everyone according to their own intellectual value. Only the one who captures the artwork with an intellectual surplus or superfluity could communicate this experience in a translation. We are facing the same condition of art. We need nothing more than a genius translator. What vivifies artworks is their content, even though it is intuitive and it is often perceived unconsciously. Its content is always the same. It is identical because ideas are immutable. In philosophy happens something similar. Its content is even more invariable than that of art, since its object is not only the sphere of ideas, but the totality of existence. That is, the will itself, and not just in its diverse manifestation and objectifications. We know that this will is one and identical. True philosophy does not stop at one side or another. It does not offer a fleeting intuitive image, but offers systematic conceptual knowledge. It is the clarification and explanation of the background of the ideas captured by art. To think about this translativity within the framework of Schopenhauer's philosophy is easy because the latter suffers from a dehistorization as severe as voluntary. His complete philosophy is ahistorical, perhaps even anti-historical, insofar as it permanently transmits his aversion to the illusion of change, of novelty, of the emerge of the different. For Schopenhauer, if poetry offers much more truth than history in order to know the essence of humanity, it is precisely because it does not fall into the delusion of seeing the same as different. While the arts are formally distinct, their content is identical. So is philosophy. While history falsely teaches that something different has happened at each moment, philosophy tries to make us understand that in all time it was, is, and will be the same for Schopenhauer. In his opinion, art has the grace of being universal, timeless, ahistorical. Time, for Schopenhauer, is a diachronic illusion, a veil of Maya, deceptive and apparent. But then, in his personal experience as a reader, he finds that translations are commonly unsatisfactory. Schopenhauer's common sense contradicts or clashes with his philosophical and systematical sense. While he recognizes the historical, local differences that take place in language and make translation so challenging, he doesn't recognize those differences when it comes to capturing ideas, when it comes to judging the contents of art. According to Schopenhauer, for example, the cat that now plays in the garden is the same cat that did the same jumps there 300 years ago. Schopenhauer can never allow historical attachment to intervene in the intuition of cats. In any case, this difficulty of Schopenhauer's rigid program is more clearly perceived as concerning the idea of humankind. For him, the most essential and intimate of it is unbearable, definitive, and universal, and everything else will be accessory. Schopenhauer is fully aware that dominating a language is dominating different thought patterns, which is precisely the reason why he recommends the acquisition of remote and ancient languages. He is able to perceive perfectly that to speak a language is to inhabit completely different structures of meaning, but he is not willing to concede that this historical dependence extends also to the arts, to the ways of signifying artistically, and also to the form and substance of our knowledge. However, Schopenhauer's pessimistic ontology does not allow this concession to history, to the development of value, of something new. Also, his pessimism doesn't allow the arts to be valued beyond their eidetic content and beyond the negative bliss they produce, the momentary and brief redemption of willing, because that would have implied accepting that there is an instance in the world that can have value in itself, a positive one. That's all. Thank you.
I think we have to take a decision. We can have a brief discussion now on these two presentations, and then we will have. What do you think about this? What's best? Oh yeah, okay. Then you have to stay here.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, it's open. Gabriele and Kasia.
Hi, I have a question for the second presentation. So it's just like a point of clarification. I wasn't aware of the fact that the kind of
Can you talk slower?
Yeah, sorry.
My English.
So I was interested in this idea of bread because I know the idea of kind of bread in different languages coming from Walter Benjamin, and I wasn't aware of the fact that Schopenhauer also used it.
Yes.
And could you talk a bit more, or maybe some of like Germanists who are present here in the audience, about the kind of relationship between Benjamin and Schopenhauer on this idea of bread in translation? That like basically Benjamin is saying that bread in different languages has different connotations, but also I'm thinking, for example, for the practice of translation, literary translation, bread and Brot in German would share, for example, this idea that, for example, if you have in poetry bread for which, for example, the connotation with red is important. So bread, red, it is rendered in German, Brot, rot, but for example, it's not in French. And for example, if you have different poems which would play on this idea of having the idea of bread, which is red, in the poem, it's not possible to kind of render it. So I'm thinking of Benjamin kind of metaphor of bread as something which kind of lends itself to those different connotations and also different creative approaches. So if you could talk a bit more about Schopenhauer.
I'm sorry to disappoint you, but in Schopenhauer, it's just an example. And he used that example, and I don't know how, I don't remember how to say this in English. Sastre? Sastre. A tailor. Are just examples. He's not thinking about poetry. He's thinking about how even easy words, everyday words, are not, even if they have an easy translation, they are not exact. They are not like circles that overlap. They are concentric. They are related in some point, but like this. Graphic.
So I think Benjamin kind of agrees. So he's saying that for the French, bread looks differently, tastes differently, whereas when we think of, for example, of German bread, maybe it's Pumpernickel, maybe it's rye bread or something like that. So for everyone, the idea of home is different and so on. But do you think that Benjamin was actually, that he has read Schopenhauer, or he was inspired by Schopenhauer? Is there like a...
I believe he did, but I'm not sure. Maybe Andres could enlighten us about that.
The word itself is taken from Schopenhauer, but also he was doing an anthology of Humboldt texts at the time. And this idea of ecus, but it's not only... It's not only connotation, but it's also a sound iconism. He said you cannot compare brot with pain, which is French. So it's also connotation, but it's also the sound iconism that makes you feel the bread in a very different way. You have like the baguette on one side, like a little bread that passes over very quickly, and the other is the brot that really remains, and you can keep it for a week. Sorry. I think Pablo probably, I mean, he translated the task as a translator, so I mean...
I don't remember. So, Gabriele?
So I want to start with your presentation and your remarks on the crisis of transferal. And I thought conceptually it would be very interesting to bring in the psychoanalytic concept of transference. Yeah. Because in a way, also from whatever you have said, especially when you talked about the untranslatable as potential, we could say that the crisis of transferal, what you call the crisis of transferal, enables the potential of transference. And I also see transference in a psychoanalytic way, not as a hindrance to translation, but enabling a translation that works with the knowledge that there is, of course, not the equivalence doesn't make sense except as something to work through the phantasms of equivalence. So that would be just a conceptual remark. But in a way, for me, it became also interesting in relation to Begonia's remarks on Schopenhauer and the translation of concepts of experience into concepts. Beckett, who was a great fan, Samuel Beckett, who was a great fan of Schopenhauer, did something that I still think is really ingenious. He went the other way around to show us what we do with philosophical concepts. He used philosophical concepts, including Schopenhauer's, and translated them back into the experiential world of literary characters. And of course, we wouldn't have living human beings that would be possible to have those kinds of embodiments of concepts. But by retranslating them, the philosophical concepts become completely absurd. And that opens the space for us to really reflect how much both our creation of concepts, but also the difference between concept and experience always opens the space for transference. So it's again probably more a comment than a question, but I would still be interested to hear what you think about it.
Well, I'm not absolutely sure about what I've said now, but no, that's true. But I think it was fundamental about two things. This idea of a crisis of transferal. On the one side, it is on the one hand, it is the Matthew talked about that, about this continuity of languages, this continuity. The translation emphasizes this continuity of languages, I would say, but also at the same time, or on the other hand, this continuity is, as Benjamin said, a continuity of transformations, and that has to do with something that I'm very interested in to talk about that in another communication. What Andrés said about decision. This continuity of transformations is a continuity of decisions, and every decision is a crisis in this continuity. And then my interest was to say that translation makes this appear, so to say, makes this continuity of transformations appear as a crisis that makes translation and language possible, and of course the original possible.
Yeah, and I was commenting on how that relates
to
what you say, translation as experience.
Yeah, exactly, yes, thank you.
I would like to say only a short thing that I found interesting what you said about Beckett. The translator, the inverse translation, not from the experience to the concepts, but to the concept to the experience, and that a lot of things can happen in that experiment. And one option is the absurd, and another option is the concept get alive or are embodied. Yes, that I was thinking about that. No, that's all. It's a reflection, an over-reflection.
So, if there aren't other comments or questions, we can go on with our two other presentations. So, Pramesh, please.
Thank you, Pablo. After that, I was hoping that I would not be called up to say anything. So thank you very much. In the tradition of the disclaimers, I should say that my Spanish is non-existent, so I want to apologize profusely. But I do want to use this 10 minutes that's available to me to gesture towards what I'm calling the productivity of the untranslatable in a particular instance of a project that had taken me 10 years to write, was written 10 years ago, and for which I'm going to apologize in 10 minutes. So the question I would really want to get at is to inquire into the way in which we might want to read the ambivalence in post-colonial registers surrounding the reading of anti-colonial nationalist texts. And so in some ways there's been a tussle for the past 20 years with the advent of post-colonial theory, with the critique of nationalism and its failures, to think again about what we might want to do with nationalist anti-colonial texts. And I suppose there are two areas that I want to probe. The first is to ask whether we ought to approach these nationalist anti-colonial texts as critics, as accomplices, or as translators. And so I think there's an indecision about how it is we ought to anticipate the problem and the project of anti-colonial nationalism. And then secondly, I want to ask whether there is something more than the thematic problematic distinction that Partha Chatterjee identified as symptomatic of nationalist anti-colonial text. In other words, is there something more than simply the dyad of the thematic problematic that attaches to nationalist anti-colonialism? So given the limitations and constraints of time, I'm going to rush to ground on the particular issue or the particular set of texts that I want to bring to your attention. In the 1920s in South Africa, there was a burgeoning of writing amongst African intellectuals in response to the hardening of attitudes to the so-called native question. The native question was basically an attempt to transfer the interpolation of the native as cultural and tribal subject to industrial worker. And so there's a huge dilemma on how to rework the categories of race and ethnicity in South Africa, but almost paralleling what is unfolding in the US under conditions of severe racism, to think again about how that subject would be transferred into this new interpolated category of the industrial worker. Now, much of the writing that took place in this instance was formed around an anticipation of the intensification of race. In other words, the stranglehold of race drew attention from a generation of young intellectuals, many of them who had entered university for the first time in what was called Lovedale and the University of Fort Hare, and and these intellectuals began to think a little bit about how one might reconstitute the argument about race. And so this is a very complex terrain. One of these texts was a text by this person, John Henderson Soga, titled The Southeastern Bantu, subsequently published by Cambridge Literary Collection, and that's very interesting as well. And Soga was the son of a translator, very important translator, Tio Soga, who had translated the Bible into Xhosa, which is a local Eastern Cape language. What is interesting about this text, however, is that it was the foundation for the emergence of a particular form of apartheid, organization of homelands. In other words, this text, which was published in the milieu of a hardening racial sensibility, was actually used to justify 20 years later the formation of homelands under apartheid. In other words, it became a text to justify, through the discipline of anthropology and through a range of other disciplinary mechanisms, why a segregation along the lines of ethnicity was possible and necessary. So the big project that I set myself in The Deaths of Hindsa, the book out of which where this problem first emerged, was to see whether we might recuperate something from these nationalist anti-colonial texts, whether there's something that might draw them out of their relation to complicity, and to find another way of thinking with them and thinking through them about how it is we might imagine a history after apartheid. In other words, whether we might constitute these texts as a different set of potentials to which they had been subjected to in the 1920s. Now, this text, I just want to give you a very brief, sketchy outline about the biography and life and times of this text. It was written in Xhosa, but Lovedale Press refused to publish the book because it did not abide by the changes in orthography for Xhosa introduced in 1928. In other words, a 400-page book was refused, was rejected by the press because it didn't abide by the new orthography that had been set by the press. And that orthography really related to the clicks in the Xhosa language. And so there was a huge battle between John Anderson Soga and the various missionaries at the Lovedale Press about making this text available, because it was a very, very substantial study of a critical part of the South African landscape from which many, many migrant workers had been drawn. Soga, in failing to get the book published with Lovedale Press, decided that he would translate the book into English himself. And he submitted it subsequently to a series at Wits University Press, University of Witwatersrand, English liberal-speaking university, that had set up a series called Bantu Studies. Now, Bantu Studies was an attempt to respond to the native question. In other words, it had been set up precisely to do the bidding of the native question from the perspective of liberal academics and liberal philosophers at the University of Witwatersrand. The Xhosa version is lost to us. There's no trace of it. It's not available. There's been, endless attempts to kind of write in the absence of that text, to think what might have appeared in the space of the Xhosa version of this text. But under the English version, however, was used to recuperate an idea of native life under conditions of industrialization. In other words, it had become the exemplar of the native question, of a response to the native question. So in this complete unenviable circumstance of its arrival in the world as a text written in Xhosa, lost to the world in Xhosa, and available in English, but in a series that trapped it in the logic of apartheid and its native questions. Soga was attempting to make a profound set of statements in this book. And so there's a question of how we might read, how we might return to this text to ask whether it has anything else it might offer us. So the question here is that I would argue that Soga's text was more than a cultural text, where meanings of race, native, and culture were worked out. In other words, it exceeded the limits of its publication. It was a text that sought to elaborate the meaning of political subjectivity through the figure of the migrant and refugee. In other words, rather than being a text of culture, this was a text that had at its very heart a concept of hospitality, of what it might mean to live political subjectivity as a migrant. And so there's a very important set of controversies that unfold in the text that do not lend themselves to the reductive ways in which the Wits University Press had received the book. My interest in this text surrounded the way in which it related to the killing of a 19th century king who had allegedly been beheaded, and who was in some ways recuperated through series of nationalist writing. In other words, an inaugural moment in nationalist narration, the killing of this Xhosa king. The British justification for the killing relates to the way in which the king had been practicing slavery. This is 1834 at the moment of the abolition of slavery. Soga's text was an attempt in its entirety to argue that in fact this was not an instance of slavery, that in fact the migrant and the refugee had arrived in this part of the world and had been drawn into the processes of a tributary society. And that what you had here was a justification for an act of war on the part of British by using mistranslation as a way to get at the colonial subjects in the Eastern Cape. So the point I want to make here I think I have a minute left, is that perhaps in the long durée of this text's arrival in the present, what we ought to be thinking about is less which histories it answers to, but what the technogenesis of the text might reveal. And I'm interested in asking, what it might mean to leave the kind of controversy that the text is involved in the moment of its conception, and to ask what else might be said about its emergence as a text in the present. In other words, can the text lend itself to thinking the post-apartheid as a desire that reconstitutes the very category of freedom by which we might want to proceed? And here I would say that perhaps the text invites us to think with it as an accomplice, but more importantly, to think about the critical way in which the refugee and the migrant might be signaling for us in this present a way to rethink political subjectivity as a condition of the relation or the untranslatable possibilities between human and technology. And that what Soga's text is doing is symptomatically producing a condition which has become for us in the contemporary a crisis that is worthy of all our attention. Thank you.
Okay. I forgot my glasses. Hi, everyone. Thanks. Thank you, Premesh, and the speakers today, and of course to Pablo and Andres and Francisca and the production team for for a really fantastic start to what looks like a very promising week and a half of conversation and inquiry. Oh, no. These don't help with text. They help with distance, with faces. No, I'm good, thank you. So my presentation addresses what I called the necessary untranslatability of the ruin in a film I made with Mark Kaplan in 2013. And the question I want to put on the table, and I want to return to, through the different iterations of the way that we approaching questions over accumulations of interventions, of propositions and presentations, is what would it mean to reckon with ruin as but one condition for the possibility of post-colonial life to come? So I'm hoping to be up to the task of thinking about that question in relation to boycott or academic boycott on Friday, and then next week to think about Kamal Al-Jafari, a filmmaker from Jaffa who's based in Berlin, and to think about how he's working with a conception of freeing the image, working through and walking through ruin, and to kind of ask these through these works of cinema questions of political, ethical, and aesthetic kind of import. In responding to the mass displacements and expulsions inflicted on Palestinians since 1947-48, and that is a very kind of a deliberate decision to mark that time. I mean, one could make a set of other choices. And to the excision of Palestine from Israel's topography, toponymy, and narratives of the past, entangled with the unresolved 20th century problematic of the Jewish question in Europe, another question arises. How could ethical demands for acknowledgement, place marking, preservation of ruins, and the struggle for restitution and return be conceived in ways that are inflected with the historical entanglements that have shaped their conditions of possibility, whilst signaling the necessary inadequacy of such efforts? And I'm not making an equivalence here of a necessary inadequacy of such efforts with untranslatability, just to be clear, because that'll get me into that's not my question. And I'm not even sure it's a valid one. The question is sharpened when considering Esmail Nashif's insight into the constitutive relationship of memory to forgetting, an insight that many critical thinkers who kind of traffic in the question of trace and afterlives, particularly of experiences of mass violence. It's a question that's sharpened in the light of the power of authoritarian ethno-nationalist regimes to so forcefully shape both terms. There is a serious problem with memory and language, Nashif writes, kind of resonating in very interesting ways with some kind of propositions that surfaced in Andres's presentation. Instead of making ruins present, memory effaces them. In Palestinian discourse, the ruins pass through this sort of thick curtain and appear merely as something to celebrate. And so I'd like to kind of take a brief itinerary. So I spent time amidst the ruins of a village called Lubia in the Galilee in northern Israel. And during a series of visits over a period of about 4 years during the making of the film The Village Under the Forest. And I want to kind of to just spend about 15 minutes, if I can, going through small moments in the film that grapple with the ruins in a variety of different ways, and then just put 2 brief propositions on the table, unelaborated, and voila. I could not talk about the journey as if it were a story with beginning, middle, and end. It was already a ruined story. Its threads were scattered across many countries, its foundations strewn as stones across the forests. But I begin in a forest that I have walked through before, South Africa Forest in Israel. Here, stones are not rocks. They are the rubble of desecration and destruction. Cacti are not vegetation. They are markers of a place that once was home. I remember my first visit to South Africa Forest in the Galilee in northern Israel. South African teenagers on a class trip at a military museum near the forest, learning about Israel's 1948 War of Independence. Afterwards, we ate lunch in the forest, under the trees I knew had been planted by the Jewish National Fund, with donations from South African Jews, me included. What I did not know was that between the passing of seasons and layers of pine needles lay the remains of the Palestinian village called Lubia. I remember the JNF blue boxes. They form memories of childhood shared by Jews the world over. Our coins would plant forests of trees across the land. We would make it green, like a modern European country. Our coins in the blue boxes would redeem the homeland of the Jewish people. My land, my heirs, and my ancestors.
بطل يفوتوا على البيت صاروا ينشفوا البيت يحطوا حزام ناشف وينشفوه قبل ما يفوتوا والجامع هدينه البيارة اللي كنا نشرب منها مي جامع مليانة أحجار قايمين بوابها وحاطين الأحجار بقلبها وزارعينه كله حرش ما رحت انت ولا مش احنا بالستينات كان له 60 سنه طالعين.
אפשר לפצץ בית במטען קטן יחסית, אם שמים את המטען באמצע החדר, זה גם פחות מסוכן. אז מצאנו שחצי קילו, חצי מנס חבלה, מעיפה בית. 3 עבדו בפיצוץ הנור ואחרים סגרו על השטח שלא יהיו אנשים. זהו.
قديش حاطين على هاي البلد قديش كذا الأخري، وإنه أعطيت الأوامر دمروها فجروها سموها اقتلوا الحيوانات اقتلوا، وفعلا قتلوا الحيوانات قبل البشر اللي صارت فيها.
In Chitin near Lubia, the commander thought that the idea was to get rid physically of the people. Well, that's what he understood, and that's what he did. There was no strategy of genocide, of massacres. Massacres were not part of the plan. In fact, when the plan did not go well, the massacres occurred. The plan was to get rid of the people by getting them out of the state, not by killing them.
כל הערבים מלובה ברחו. אז קיבלתי מיד פקודה מהאלוף להרוס את הבתים בצ'יק צ'אק, כי פחדו שהם יחזרו בחזרה אחרי הכיבוש. אז אני לקחתי פה יותר, כבר היה לי אז מחלקה שלמה, ובמחלקה הזו הורדנו את זה בצ'יק צ'אק, אחד אחרי השני. בית, עד שעפו כולם. שם יותר מ1,000 בתים היו שם.
بروح اصلي بلوبيا، بديش اصلي بالجامع، بدي اروح اصلي بلوبيا. هناك بكيف وبنبسط.
انا اللي ما بحبه كنت بروح باجي على تراكتور رايح جاي. احراش عملوه عشان يخبوا البلد انه فيش بلد هون، لكن في صبر ببين انه في بلد هون.
This is the map which was drawn by this man from Syria.
ما كناش نقدر نزور هون ولا مرة قدرنا نزور البلد بالفترة السابقة لحد سنة 67 كان حكم عسكري مطلق على كل القرى العربية، وكل واحد في الجليل بده يتجول مجبور ياخذ تصريح من الحاكم العسكري اللي موجود في المنطقة تبعته. أول مرة الأهل بزوروا البلد كانت سنة 75 وقتها شافوها إنها مدمرة.
These villages were Arabs, and the whole landscape around them was Arab. They almost sent a very annoying message to the Zionist movement, and they write about it. They wrote about it that they really didn't like the fact, Ben-Gurion called it, that the country still looks Arab. It still looks Arab. It's too Arab. Despite the fact that the Arabs are not there anymore, it looks Arab. And in the rural area, he was very clear that the villages just have to be wiped out so that there's no memory. They started doing it intensively already in August 1948. They flattened the houses, the land, nothing was left. And there were two ways in which they wanted to hide the existence. One was to plant recreational forest over the villages with European pine trees. So in most cases, when the villages were huge and their lands were quite widespread, you can see both. You can see the new Jewish settlement, and you see next to it a pine tree recreational forest. The second method that they used was to establish a Jewish settlement over it with almost the same name as the Arab village, but giving it a Hebrew version. That served two purposes. One, to show that it was originally Jewish, and now it's back to its original ownership, and also to send a sinister message to Palestinians of what happened there.
Okay, this is the last clip. To the speech of conquest are the voice.
يا مويا ما الدهر شو غالي علي ولويت الفن لي علي وللوبي إلها همي علي وأرضها أغلى من لرات الذهب
أنا والله كثير حافظة. أنا بعرف فنس، أنا ناسيتها.
أنا بألف مرات هيك قصائد أبيات شعر، وطبعا البلد بتأخذ الحيز الأوفر بهذا الأكبر بهذا المجال وبهذا الموضوع. طبعا ماتوا بنفسيات هن وإن عم بينتظروا إنهم يرجعوا. كيف حكوا لهم إنه اطلعوا جمعة زمان وبترجعوا يومين أو ثلاثة، وراحوا من الدنيا وإن عم بيستنوا إنهم يرجعوا. وجيل بقلط جيل وبستنى عمل الرجوع، وإن شاء الله بكون في رجوع. سمعت لوبي الحزينة عم تنادي رجعوا عم بنتظركوا يا أولادي، من 60 ونيف هجرتوني وبعدكوا ما ذقت طعم السعادة. جيبوا أولادكوا تيعرفوني وعلي يشوروا يقولوا بلادي. أمحها صرخ لي انتو اللي زرعتوني وحصدني غيركم بموسم حصادي. وشجرها قال لي ما حرقتوني بوجه العدا تا أصبح رمادي. وليل الظلم مهما طال ظلمه لبد الصبح يزحلوا البرادي.
It's not a Palestinian history, as if we would say that the Shoah is a Jewish history. It's also German history, it's European history, it's a human history also, the history of humanity also. And for us as Israelis, the Nakba is our history too. And it's not easy, it's not a pleasant one to study sometimes, but okay, it's our own history. And I'm sure that if we think in terms of living here in peace and reconciliation with the people from this land, the Palestinians, no way it can happen without the acknowledgement and responsibility taken by Israelis to what's happened in 1948, including the support of the right of return of the Palestinian refugees.
Thank you. Actually, that's the view that into Tel Aviv from Yafa that we're going to flip around with Kamal Al-Jafari's film. Just a synchronicity. So, I mean, I don't need to comment. That will come out in conversation that kind of this reiterative move to translate, to engage, to through ritual, through meaning, through poetry, through song, through story, through kind of cartographic, through the map. So I just want to place two propositions on the table, and I want to connect them for now. The first is that the creation of a modern political Zionist version and vision of history, it has involved two important yet interconnected negations that have accompanied its drive to reshape facts on the ground. A term that signifies both the symbolic space of discourse, of ideas, of cartographic imaginaries, political claims, and moral narratives, as well as the territorial, material, and topographical dimensions of coercive placemaking, in which ruins figure in quite complex ways, including through a range of disciplinary apparatus such as archaeology. But the first negation is the negation of the historicity of the Jewish diaspora, most particularly in the Arab world, in Africa and the Americas, but of course also in Europe. And I think this is raised very kind of poignantly by Amnon Raz Krakotskin, who reads Gershom Sholem Benjamin and Mahmoud Darwish together. Reducing the heterogeneity of diaspora and of Jewish life to the teleology of the Nazi concentration camp, this negation has functioned as a very powerful justificatory narrative for the law of return, which is one of Israel's basic laws that confers automatic political rights to citizenship to Jewish people to return, or rather to ascend to Zion. And the second negation is the negation of the collective existence of Palestinians, including historically, discursively. There are a range of techniques. My point is that these two negations are connected, they're entangled, deeply asymmetrically, but they're present in one another in ways that are very difficult to kind of mark and raise in this particular moment. And this negation of Palestinian collective existence has been called variously the Nakba, politicide, memoricide, and that is the destruction and replacement of the physical traces of collective existence of Palestinians expelled prior to and during that 1947-48 war, whose subsequent predicaments as well as possibilities to return are abrogated through a range of complex techniques and strategies, in which the ruins are material remains of Palestinian urbanity, amongst many other things. So the possibilities of a future or of a post-colonial life then would require a reckoning with the ruins that may hold these two negations in some kind of touch. So in a relationship for the future as a difficult but necessary kind of move, obligation, effort. A reckoning that might be adequate to figuring the remnants of destroyed towns and villages as they mess with conceptions of spatial memory as episodic variously. So kind of memory as episodic, successive, sequential, or durational, or all of these. So the ruins mess with temporality. To return to Lubya then is not to return to emptied space. One has to negotiate the concealment of ruins as traces of intention, that they be buried, that the ruins be wiped out, that they be officially forgotten, leaving no means of return and nowhere to return to. So to return to Ismail Nashif, ruins cannot be celebrated. And he continues, challenges us rather, to remain in the ruins, turning their logic into what he calls a ruins perspective, which is also a critique of ruins. Get out of the form, get rid of language and memory, return to matter, he says, in a strange kind of rerouting via Bergson to think about this challenge and invitation to both inhabit and respond to ruin. Return to matter, a kind of return that does not involve expulsion, a full indulgence in it, suggesting one possibility for a post-colonial life to come. Thank you.
So we have some time for the discussion. What hour is it? 1:20 or something like that? Yeah. No, well, okay. It's okay.
Hi, Heidi. Thank you for your documentary. It was very interesting. I will try to organize my thoughts, because maybe I'm watching this from different pathways. I don't know. But how would you think that we can understand this from the translation perspective, from the translation studies? Since I think that there is an inevitable translation of the village, right? The village was translated into ruins, right? And when you talk about the negation of the Palestinian collective, is like a way of erase the original text, right? And it's a way to, like the functionalist theory, when it says that we have to focus on the target text and not in the original text. From that perspective, we can talk about the translation of images, and we can see this from the transfiction point of view. When we talk about transfiction, we can see, or transfiction is focused on how act the translator as characters in film and in literature. And we can see here there is a translator. It's an invisible translator. It's a silent translator, or maybe it's not that silent. Maybe it's a politician translator. We can see politicians as translators here. They transform a village into a ruin, right? Or into a forest, right? What would you think it is better from the translation studies point of view, to see this as a translation of images, or we can see it better if we talk about a transfiction? I tried to organize my thoughts, but it was so beautiful, so I'm still thinking about it. But that's more or less my question.
Thank you. Should I respond?
Yeah.
Should we? Okay. Thanks for the question. So, not being of translation studies, although I'm sure sharing a whole number of beloved texts, right? I need you to translate to me what you mean by transfiction. But before that, just to say that, I think so. The ruin is a material it's a remnant, and it's kind of it's found behind multiple attempts to penetrate it, right? So, in a sense, the layers of destruction and concealment and re-inhabiting, re-entering, reinterpreting, in other words, translating, reauthoring, is part of the denseness of the space and the lives associated. And the lives associated are not, I think it's important not to hold them inside of a kind of a political or geographical imaginary that takes the territory on its terms, right? It's much it's more dispersed than that. And it needs to be apprehended, I would say. Need is too strong, but I would urge that it's apprehended as dispersed and as dense, as layered. And so there's no possibility of return to an origin or an original. And in a sense, one has to, we have to figure out that desire, but also resist it. Right, and that's where I think the work of translation is so important, is that it asks, at least if I understood Pablo's conception of translativity, it has a very strong temporal kind of dimension that asks for both a pause, it asks for a risk, for an uncertainty, for a reaching out and a reading and a rereading and a rewriting as a permanent effort. But at the same time, as an effort to work against the desire to find something beyond the fragment, beyond the remnants, the ruins themselves. And this is something we have to negotiate to talk about a post-colonial life to come. I think just to speak kind of sideways to a point that Premesh made about post-apartheid freedom, I think there's a strong kind of a gesture there to think about what are the ways in which one reads, inhabits, responds ethically that could open up a space to a space of such dense violences, multiple violences, to thinking possibilities for life. And I think that, so translation for me is one way, and this is not from a translation studies perspective, that's not. I hope I answered you to some satisfaction.
Yeah, Smilat.
Thank you. My question is about the post-colonial life to come, but I'll direct it to Pramesh's presentation. I was wondering if you could say just a little more, because you concluded very suggestively and quickly, a little more about how you conceptually would ground something like untranslatability and multilingualism at the heart of formulation of political subjectivity. And then connected back to your point of reading post-colonial nationalists as figures of translators, who in translation of colonial discourse were able to translate something that exceeded the colonial discourse, something of the past that prior to the moment of colonial encounter into the future. And then in reflecting that, sort of think about the anti-colonial discourse. What kind of translators are those who would we can categorize as anti-colonial within the anti? And it seems to me there is a disavowed indebtedness there, and which would then take us back to the questions of the legacy of the anti-colonial nationalism. Thank you.
Wow, those are. Thank you very much. I think I'm causing havoc. Yeah. Let's just think a little bit along the lines of the questions you posed. In some ways, the argument of the book that I'm putting forward, and one which I hope I'd never have to return to again. Hopefully, this is the last time I'm going to apologize for the book. Is that, in some sense, it proved inadequate to its ambition, which was to try and set an agenda for what it might mean to think about a history after apartheid. One that produced the concept of difference, that was different to apartheid's difference, but one that also began to set the terms of what it might mean to bring the aesthetic into a much more proximate relation to the problematic of violence and history. So it was trying to map out a little bit what we might call the distinction between, history and apocalypse, and to find a place of stumbling, if you like. And so the book begins with the healer diviner who has a dream about the skull of this king, and goes in 1996 on the eve of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to retrieve the skull from Britain, and comes back with the skull from Inverness. And, it's an impossible, to use a term that was coined by a colleague, Adam Seitz, an impossible machine that was constituted as the kind of moment of transition from the apartheid to the post-apartheid. So to offer another history, if you like, or another genealogy of the problematic of race. And I think the critique of apartheid registers in some ways as a critique of late coloniality. So apartheid is associated as a derivative discourse of late coloniality. And I want to posit in the new work I'm doing is that actually I think apartheid might be more adequately represented in relation to the abolition of slavery. And that, there's a distinction between the kind of problem of race as it registers in late coloniality. I mean, we know this through the work of Mahmoud Mamdani and others, but and the question of how one might think about slavery as the kind of activating dynamic in a concept of race that that returns uncannily, if you like, through much of the 20th century. So just to say that, in some ways, the work of untranslatability there is to think a little bit about what I'm calling the becoming technical of the human. That I think apartheid might be more than, and, Moritz and I would go back and forth on this, I think, biopolitics that is, given. In other words, their colleagues who have argued that apartheid is a biopolitics that was global to begin with. And I'm suggesting, I think there's something more going on there, and that we might want to return to these texts that have given us both the kind of biopolitical reading, but that have also offered us more to think with. So just, I suppose, if I'm in the ballpark, let me know. The question of the anti-colonial is to also mark its limit and to take care of a certain limit there. What we've done, I think, too hastily is surrendered the ground with an encounter with the discourses of the anti-colonial, if you like. And I suspect that what's happened there is that that's been the fertile ground of the emergent nationalist, kind of intensified nationalism and right-wing political formations and neoliberal formations in our present. And so I'm asking us to return then to not cede that ground, to hold on to the critique, but to also approach that with a little bit more, a little care. And so taking care of that limit is going to be critical for rethinking the post-colonial or recharging it as a kind of effective mode of thinking the present. And so I'm deeply critical of these, the return to origins, the search for human origins, migrations. I'm deeply critical. But I can also see how in one way we might want to bring them back into play, partly because what they produce as a concept of political subjectivity in the refugee and the migrant. So they're not lost to us as texts. So let me just leave it there. I mean, does that more or less play in the space that you were posing the questions? I mean, there's a lot more to say about the failure of this book. So don't read it. But, I do want to move beyond that in some sense, partly because I don't think that the question of the post-apartheid has been adequately thought through. And I think we need to return to this question as a question not of South Africa, but a post-apartheid as that other promise of the end of race as an organizing category. So the two moments I'm marking, if you like, if we want to think about rhymes, 1834 and 1994. 1834 with the abolition of slavery, that did not place race under erasure. In fact, it reconstituted race as a category of domination. And then 1994, which again promised something of a shift in the terrain.
Could you just unpack a little bit what the alternative narrative is in the book, which you just told me not to read, but I'm going to go read it, okay? About this king, no longer as a slave king, right, legitimizing that topos and narrative, but rather as complicit with the indigenous movements. That went so quickly because right, that's the bridge to your idea of this other narrative, which is the narrative of the refugee and the migrant. And I just went too quickly.
So basically, as the story goes, the abolition of slavery was parallel to the formation of the Aborigines Commission in the 1830s. And I'm arguing that, in fact, we might want to think a little bit about the shifts in natural philosophy and science, the revolutions in tech. I mean, this is the moment when the Cambridge the Cambridge Three, Babbage, Herschel, and Whelan, introduced mathematics as a kind of formation that would lead to a major shift in communication technology, which I think returns in 48 with cybernetics. So I'm trying to make all of these connections, but to get back to the 1834 moment, what happens is that the British adopt the sentiment of the Aborigines Commission and accuse the local king of practicing slavery, or what appears as slavery. And as a consequence of that, launch an attack and they break up the kind of local polities. And I'm suggesting that, in fact, what these nationalist writers are doing in the 1920s is to try and reset the agenda of what's unfolding in 1834 by suggesting that, in fact, this was not slavery. This was the question of the migrant and refugee as political subject. And therefore, and so what's happening in the 1900s is that the black subject is being marked as a migrant under the segregationist laws of apartheid. So that migrant is is claiming a determining role in figuring out political subjectivity. So they reclaim a kind of moment of what might be called misrepresentation or corrective on colonial history, and reinscribe it as an argument about the position of the migrant in the native subject as a migrant subject within.
And that's the topos you want to have as being the future of the post-apartheid.
I would say that we need to think seriously about how we might think political subjectivity beyond citizen and subject, and that we need to organize, as my colleague Zureen Pillay says in South Africa, a way of thinking the migrant as political or refugee as a political subject. So not a subject in need, but a subject that constitutes the political in a definitive way.
It will turn out in a question. So first of all, going back to Premesh, it is very particular that you say that you have to apologize all the time for doing the book, which recalls as well for the... it relates to something that happened in, maybe people are aware or not aware, that in Sweden there was an institute for race studies, and it was introduced, I think, in 1922 or something like that. And then it was later considered by the Germans, let's say, for the justification of racial differentiation, and which is ironic as well, because Sweden was in part, let's say, of the war, but still they had like these thoughts about that also were related to the political status of the Sami, of the people, of the natives of the north. Exactly. So it's really interesting. It resounds completely like that, because they're trying to, let's say, apologize or revive those studies, and all the academics that are trying to work in the context in which it was born, because it's the center of Sweden that was the one Dalarna focused on that study. They have been criticized greatly. Also, they have very terrible reviews in Yelp. So it's yeah, so it's very particular, because in order to address those problems in contemporary issues, it's very relevant as well to reread them in what you offer. And I think it's a very interesting view, because people, I don't know, they're even less interested in literature, let's say modernist after post-structuralism. Nobody wants to study modernism, because they say, why would you study that after the construction, right? So it's very interesting, the thing that you have to apologize, but still I think it's very interesting in a contemporary theme. Another thing I wanted to talk about, going to you, Heidi, is two things mostly. First is like a reminiscent thing about the donation thing that in my school, I was raised in a Catholic school, very conservative, all girls, and we were supposed to raise money for a school in Kinshasa. Every year we had to do this rifles, is it called rifles? I don't know, like contest that we had to raise a lot of money for the Kinshasa, and it turns out that they were trying to convert people in Kinshasa instead of, I don't know, building schools, or there was a huge scandal. And so it made me think, because I was so frustrated, because of course I raised tons of money for the schools in Kinshasa, and later we realized that the nuns were doing something else with the money there. So just It was awful. So it really made me think about that. It was awful. I feel really bad about it. And the other thing is that I'm very shocked, mostly in contemporary times, because I feel poetry doesn't have, let's say, the relevance or the power it used to have, even in academics. Like, people are less and less interested, or they say that poetry is so difficult to read, to understand, but still people recognize the power that poetry has as a source of memory, let's say, or as a way, they still think that it's important. So it was beautiful to see always that people recur to poetry for reminiscing, or for just, I don't know, keeping stories within the families and the country. So it's very shocking still that people recognize the power of poetry, but still academics and even schools maybe learning poetry is such a dread. So it's amazing that it happens in real life apparently as well. So it's more of a comment that is shocking. And the final thing about translation that he mentioned maybe is that in the case, of course, of Israel and Palestine, it's weird because you always have to position yourself as if you are pro-Palestine or pro-Israel. So if you start talking about Palestine, then you're pro-Palestine. And I think in translation it happens as well very often that you have to position yourself, right? Is it possible to translate? Is it not possible to translate? And it seems that translation itself seems to be the medium where they join, right? Which is a very interesting thing that I had not thought about. And you just brought it up by a problem, of course, even contemporary, that you always have to be pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. You can't be in between. And maybe poetry or memory here, mediated by translation, is where probably they can join. So if I am pro-Palestine and you are pro-Israel, whatever, then the coming together would be through translation. So the acceptance of both sides. And so something like that. I think it's a very interesting way of seeing the problem.
That's it. Last one. Okay. Just, yeah, thanks for that. I think even the kind of the staking of a discursive terrain that says pro or anti is already a translation. Mm-hmm. And which relates to a point I made about the power of a regime-aligned discourse to shape the terms. And so I think that kind of attunement to the work of words is part of a kind of, there's a work of poesis that's required to create a terrain that is there, but requires some ground clearing. And that, in this particular, I don't want to call it a conflict, and I don't have a word for it, in this particular encounter of multiple violences in a way, where even words are so weaponized, it's particularly important to create in relationship, in community, even if it's a transient or a temporary one. So thanks for that comment. And I just want to add that the kind of the hardening of the way of identitarian categories and positions that are linked to, I think, a kind of a return of a form of the biopolitical that comes out of race studies. I think it's a symptom of a process that's happening globally. And to just, I'm not surprised by what you say about this institute in Sweden, and neither that it's a site of a kind of renewed intellectual effort to reinvigorate and legitimize biological race sciences to make certain kind of political moves now. But to kind of return, I think it's not only in the South African context that the kind of imagining a political subjectivity, or at least the staking of a discursive terrain and an ethical and political one, that's imagined through the figure of the migrant and refugee. I mean, I think it's not linked to the territory of South Africa. I think that there's something, I mean, in my own project that I'm really interested in getting at around a political subject that is deeply linked to multiple historical experiences of being stateless. So yeah, thanks for that.
Well, yeah, I think we are done with this session, and well, we have to translate us into the other room for lunch. So